The most powerful man in Hollywood faced an impossible choice. Subscribe for untold stories of true character. Like if you believe love changes everything, what would you sacrifice for someone who understood your soul? If you are ready, let me begin. She walked into the Malpaso Productions office on a Tuesday morning in March 1982, carrying a script that would change everything. Victoria Sterling was 34, a respected producer who had quietly built her reputation by turning modest budgets into remarkable films. She had dark hair that caught light in unexpected ways, and eyes that seemed to see through the Hollywood facade that surrounded everyone else. Clint Eastwood was 52 at the absolute peak of his power. He had just finished directing and starring in Firefox. His production company was thriving, and every studio in town wanted to work with him. He was also married to Maggie Johnson, his wife of nearly 30 years, and had 2 children who looked at him like he was invincible. Victoria had requested this meeting to discuss a project about a Civil War photographer, a small, intimate drama that needed Clint's gravitas and Malpaso's resources. She sat across from his desk in the Burbank office, morning light streaming through windows that overlooked the studio lot where Clint had built his empire. What happened in that meeting was supposed to be business. Victoria presented her vision for the film with quiet passion, explaining how the photographer's journey mirrored America's struggle to document its own conscience. Clint listened in his characteristic stillness, occasionally asking questions that revealed he understood not just the commercial potential, but the artistic heart of the story. The meeting ran 2 hours longer than scheduled. Neither of them noticed. For the next 6 weeks they met regularly to develop the project, always professional, always focused on the work. Victoria would arrive at Malpaso with revised script pages, and Clint would review them with the same attention he brought to everything he cared about. Their conversations moved beyond the film to books, to the responsibility of storytelling, to the loneliness of making decisions that affected hundreds of people's livelihoods. Victoria never mentioned her personal life. Neither did Clint, but something was building between them that had nothing to do with the Civil War photographer and everything to do with recognition. 2 people who had learned to carry authority quietly, who understood that real strength was measured in restraint, who had spent years surrounded by people who wanted something from them rather than understanding them. The first crack in their professional facade came during a location scout in Nevada. They had driven to Virginia City to examine potential shooting sites and found themselves alone in an abandoned mine shaft that perfectly captured the isolation Victoria had written into her script. The silence between them had weight now, heavy with things that couldn't be said. This is where he realizes he can't just observe anymore, Victoria said, her voice echoing off the stone walls. He has to choose whether to document the truth or protect the people he has come to care about. Clint nodded, but he was looking at her instead of the mine shaft. Sometimes the hardest choice is between 2 right things. Victoria met his eyes. They both knew they weren't talking about the script anymore. They drove back to Los Angeles in careful silence, the desert landscape passing like a movie. Neither of them was watching. When Clint pulled into the Malpaso parking garage, Victoria didn't immediately get out of the car. She sat there for a moment, her hand on the door handle, weighing something. "Clint," she said quietly, "we need to be careful." He nodded. "I know." But knowing didn't stop what was already happening. The project moved forward. Victoria's script was polished, casting discussions began, and pre-production scheduling filled Clint's calendar. But now, every business meeting carried undercurrents that had nothing to do with film. When Victoria leaned over his desk to point out a dialogue revision, Clint caught her perfume, something subtle that reminded him of rain. When he walked her to her car after late evening sessions, the distance between them seemed both too much and not nearly enough. They were professionals. They were disciplined. They were also human beings caught in something stronger than their considerable willpower. The moment that changed everything happened on a Thursday evening in May. Victoria had stayed late to work through budget projections with Clint and his business manager. When the meeting ended, she and Clint found themselves alone in the office. the building empty except for a security guard making rounds somewhere on the lower floors. Victoria was gathering her papers when she dropped a folder. Pages scattered across Clint's office floor, and they both knelt to collect them. Their hands touched, reaching for the same sheet of paper. The contact lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt like a confession. They looked at each other, still kneeling on the office carpet surrounded by scattered budget reports. The space between them disappeared. Clint reached up to touch her face, and Victoria closed her eyes at the contact. When she opened them again, everything had changed. "We can't," she whispered. "I know," he said, but neither of them moved away. They could have stopped then. They should have stopped then. Instead, Clint helped her to her feet, and Victoria didn't step back when he kept her hands in his. They stood there in his office with the Hollywood lights spread out below the windows, both of them understanding that they were about to cross a line that would make everything else complicated. The kiss was inevitable, soft questioning, then deeper as Victoria's resolve dissolved and Clint's control finally slipped. When they separated, the office felt different. The whole world felt different. "This can't happen," Victoria said, but she was still close enough that Clint could feel her breath. "No," he agreed. "It can't." They agreed it couldn't happen, and then they made it happen anyway. Carefully, quietly, with the same discipline they brought to everything else, but applied now to secrecy instead of propriety. Dinners disguised as business meetings. Drives to location scouts that lasted longer than necessary. Conversations that revealed more about who they were when the cameras weren't rolling than either had shared with another person in years. Victoria understood Clint's silences, knew when he was thinking through a creative problem versus wrestling with a personal one. Clint saw through Victoria's professional competence to the woman who had built her career by being twice as prepared as any man in the room, because she knew the margin for error was different for her. They never spoke about Maggie directly. They never discussed the impossibility of their situation, or made plans beyond the current project. They existed in a stolen space between Clint's public life and Victoria's private discipline, two people who had found something real in a town built on pretense. For 4 months, they managed the impossible balance. The Civil War photographer project moved forward, gaining studio interest and attracting quality actors. Clint's marriage continued its stable, predictable pattern. Victoria maintained her reputation as a producer who delivered exceptional work under budget and ahead of schedule. But secrets in Hollywood are like water in a cracked foundation. Eventually, they find their way to the surface. The first sign of exposure came from an unexpected source, Clint's assistant, who had worked for him for 8 years and knew his patterns better than he knew them himself. She didn't say anything directly, but her scheduling began to show subtle awareness. Business meetings with Victoria were no longer scheduled back with other appointments. Phone calls from Victoria were put through immediately, even when Clint was in meetings with studio heads. The second sign was more dangerous. An entertainment reporter had noticed Victoria's car in the Malpaso parking garage at unusual hours and had started asking casual questions about their collaboration. Nothing direct, nothing accusatory, but the kind of preliminary fishing that preceded more serious investigation. The crisis came on a Tuesday evening in September. Clint was at home in Carmel with Maggie, having dinner on the terrace overlooking the Pacific Ocean. It was one of those perfect Northern California evenings when the light turns everything golden, the kind of setting that should have reminded him how much he had to lose. His phone rang. Victoria's voice was tight with controlled panic. "We have a problem," she said. "I need to see you tonight." Clint glanced at Maggie, who was reading the newspaper and enjoying her wine, comfortable in the routine they had built over nearly 3 decades. "I can't leave tonight. Clint, a photographer, followed me home from Malpaso. Someone knows." The words hit him like cold water. He walked inside, away from Maggie, and closed his study door. "How sure are you?" "I saw the flash when I was getting out of my car." He was across the street, telephoto lens. "This isn't gossip anymore. Someone has pictures." Clint closed his eyes. 29 years of marriage, 2 children. a reputation built on professionalism and reliability. Everything he had constructed could collapse because of 4 months of stolen afternoons with a woman who made him remember what it felt like to be understood. "What do you want to do?" he asked quietly. Victoria's voice was steady despite the circumstances. "I want to protect you and your family. This is my fault for not being more careful. It is not your fault. Clint, you have too much to lose. I won't be the person who destroys what you've built." They arranged to meet the next morning at dawn on the beach near Point Reyes. Neutral ground, away from the city where they could talk without surveillance or interruption. Clint told Maggie he had early meetings in San Francisco. She kissed him goodbye without suspicion, the way she had kissed him goodbye thousands of times before. The beach was empty when Clint arrived. Victoria was already there, standing at the water's edge with her back to the road, watching waves break against the rocks. She looked smaller than usual, diminished by the vast landscape and the weight of what they needed to discuss. They walked along the shoreline without touching, the distance between them measuring everything they were about to lose. Victoria spoke first. "Simone will approach you within the week, probably with photos, definitely with demands." Clint nodded. He had seen enough Hollywood scandals to know how these things unfolded. What do they want? Money, probably, or cooperation on some other story. It doesn't matter. Once they have leverage, they'll keep using it. They stopped walking. The ocean stretched endlessly ahead of them. Indifferent to human complications, Victoria turned to face him, and Clint saw that she had already made her decision. "I am moving to New York," she said. "I have offers there. I can produce films from the East Coast. We won't see each other again." The words hit harder than Clint had expected. "Victoria, this is the only way to protect what you have. What if I don't want to protect it? What if I want to choose you?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Victoria searched his face, looking for something. When she spoke again, her voice was gentle but final. "You can't choose me, Clint. You are not that kind of person." "What kind of person am I?" "You are the kind who keeps his word, who honors his commitments, who protects the people who depend on him. That is why I fell in love with you, and that is why I am walking away." Clint stared at the horizon. She was right, and they both knew it. He had built his entire life on reliability, on being someone people could count on. Maggie had invested 29 years in their marriage. His children trusted him to be the steady center of their world. His business partners, his crew members, everyone in his professional orbit depended on his consistency. "What about the film?" he asked. "The Civil War photographer. I'll transfer the rights to Malpaso. No charge. Consider it my final gift to you." Victoria reached into her jacket and pulled out an envelope. "My resignation from the project, effective immediately. I've recommended 3 other producers who can finish what we started." Clint took the envelope but didn't open it. "This isn't how I wanted it to end. Neither did I. But this is how it has to end." They stood there in the dawn light, 2 people who had found something rare and were choosing to let it go rather than destroy everything else around them. The decision was quiet, disciplined, and absolutely devastating. Victoria stepped closer, close enough to touch, but careful not to. "I want you to know something. These 4 months were the most honest I've ever been with another person. You saw me as I actually am, not as what I thought you needed. That is a gift I'll carry forever." Clint's voice was rough when he answered. "You made me remember who I was before I became who everyone else needed me to be. Then we gave each other something real." Victoria kissed him once softly on the cheek. Then she walked away across the sand toward her car. Clint stood alone on the beach, watching the most dangerous and beautiful thing in his life disappear into the morning mist. The photographer never approached him. The threatened exposure never materialized. Clint never learned whether Victoria had somehow managed the situation or whether the threat had been less serious than they feared. What mattered was that they had chosen to end it themselves, on their own terms, before anyone else could use their love as a weapon. Victoria Sterling moved to New York and became one of the most respected independent producers on the East Coast. She never married, though she was linked romantically to several prominent men. In interviews, she spoke about her work with passion, but never mentioned her time developing projects with Clint Eastwood. Clint finished the Civil War photographer film using Victoria's script and one of the producers she had recommended. The movie was quietly beautiful and moderately successful, though critics noted an unusual melancholy in Clint's performance that they couldn't quite identify. He remained married to Maggie for another 2 years before their marriage ended, for reasons that had nothing to do with Victoria Sterling. They never saw each other again, but 20 years later, when Victoria died unexpectedly of a heart attack in her Manhattan apartment, Clint attended her funeral. He sat in the back row of the church, unrecognized among the New York film community who had come to honor her work. When the service ended, he left quietly without speaking to anyone. Among Victoria's papers, her executor found a single script, a story about a Civil War photographer who falls in love with a woman he can never have and must choose between documenting the truth and protecting the people he cares about. Written in the margins in Victoria's handwriting were notes that began, "For the man who taught me that love sometimes means letting go." Was it sacrifice or wisdom that kept them apart? The answer depends on whether you believe that some loves are too important to risk destroying with possession, or whether the deepest regret comes from chances not taken when they could have changed everything.